You weren't loud. You weren't dramatic. And that's exactly what scared them. You didn't shout when they crossed the line. You didn't explode when they lied, betrayed, or dismissed you. No, you just got quiet. And in a world addicted to noise, where people mistake volume for value and chaos for control, your silence became a threat they didn't know how to handle. They thought your silence meant you had nothing to say. They didn't realize you were holding back oceans behind closed lips. They mistook your restraint for weakness, your patience for passivity, your calm for surrender. But what they never saw was that every second you didn't respond, you were observing, studying, learning, planning. You didn't shrink, you sharpened. See, some people make noise to feel powerful. You stayed silent because you already were. You weren't trying to win the argument. You were done participating in it. You didn't raise your voice. You raised your standard. They thought you walked away because you couldn't handle the fire. But you were the fire. You just refused to burn for people who kept playing with matches. And while they mocked your silence, laughed behind your back, played you like you were disposable, you were preparing. Not to fight back, but to outgrow the war. They thought you were ghosting them. You were growing through them. And when they finally realized your silence wasn't fear but focus, it was already too late. You had become someone they couldn't reach, couldn't read, couldn't touch. Because silence isn't the absence of words, it's the presence of power. And now, in the stillness they once laughed at, they feel it. The echo of everything you never said. The regret of what they missed while you were quietly becoming everything they never thought you'd be. This isn't the story of someone who ran. This is the story of someone who watched the storm, survived it in silence, and came back stronger than ever. Because silence was never your weakness. It was your strategy. It didn't start with betrayal. It started with small dismissals, tiny cuts you almost didn't notice at first. A sigh when you tried to express how you felt. A smirk when your voice cracked under the weight of everything you had held in for too long. You're too sensitive. You always overthink things. Why do you always have to make everything so heavy? They'd say it with a laugh, sometimes with a smile, as if your pain was an inconvenience to the lightness of their world. You weren't asking for the world. You were asking to be understood, but somehow even that became too much. You tried. God, you tried. You explained your triggers. You offered your heart in pieces. You spoke in soft tones, hoping softness would be returned. But it wasn't. You were met with rolled eyes, half-hearted nods, and answers that felt more like exits than empathy. Conversations that ended in silence, not the peaceful kind, but the hollow one. The kind that told you your feelings were not just unimportant, they were unwanted. You started shrinking, slowly, censoring your truth, diluting your needs, thinking maybe, if you were less, they would finally love you more. But what really cut deep wasn't what they said. It was how they made you question your own voice. You began to second-guess every instinct. Every time your gut said, "This doesn't feel right," their words said, "You're just imagining it." They twisted facts into fog, made you feel unstable in your own reality. And you believed them, not because you were weak, but because you loved them, because you trusted them more than you trusted yourself. That's the tragedy of gaslighting. It doesn't scream. It whispers just enough to make you wonder if you're the problem. And the more you tried to fix things, the more broken you became. You stayed up late crafting messages that you retyped 10 times, hoping this time they'd hear you. that they'd see the love behind the pain. But instead, you got silence, or worse, mockery. Your vulnerability became their entertainment. Your breakdowns became reasons to call you dramatic. Your efforts became evidence that you cared too much. And slowly, it began to dawn on you. Your voice wasn't being heard. It was being used against you. That realization didn't come with fireworks. It came quietly, like a curtain falling after the final act. You were sitting across from someone, speaking with every ounce of honesty you had left, and they were scrolling their phone. You paused, expecting them to look up. They didn't. That's when it hit you. You were explaining your soul to someone who had already decided not to listen. That was the moment your silence began. Not because you didn't care, but because you finally understood. They didn't. You started noticing things. The patterns. The way they only reached out when they needed something. The way they disappeared when you were struggling. The way your presence was taken for granted until you dared to pull it back. And that shift, it wasn't loud. It didn't come with a confrontation. It came with you choosing to say nothing the next time they ignored you. It came with you letting the phone ring instead of answering. It came with you walking away mid-sentence, not out of anger, but because you'd finally realized your words were being wasted. People think silence is sudden, that it means you just gave up one day. But silence doesn't begin in a moment. It begins in a series of moments, moments when you try and try and try, until trying feels like screaming into a void, and eventually you stop. Not because you're cold, but because you're done setting yourself on fire just to light up someone else's darkness. You weren't weak. You were exhausted. And in that exhaustion, you found something stronger than rage. You found clarity. The kind of clarity that makes you sit still, not because you have nothing left to say, but because you finally realized saying it won't change anything. You've outgrown explaining, outgrown proving, outgrown the need to convince people of your worth. You see, silence isn't born out of weakness. It's born out of awareness, and now you sit in that silence, not as a victim, but as a survivor. You've learned that the loudest people aren't always the strongest, that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who says nothing, because they're not fighting anymore. They're choosing peace over chaos, choosing self-respect over performance, choosing not to waste another breath on people who heard your voice but never truly listened to your heart. That was the beginning of everything. That first quiet moment when you decided not to beg, not to plead, not to argue. That first time you let the silence speak for you. And in that moment, you realized something profound. Your silence echoed louder than all your explanations ever did. That was the first warning they never took seriously. But it would not be the last. It was a moment you'll never forget, not because of what was said, but because of what you didn't say. The argument wasn't even the loudest one. In fact, that's what made it worse. It was calm, almost rehearsed. Their words cut clean like knives, dipped in sugar. They twisted the truth so effortlessly, you started to wonder if you imagined everything again. The betrayal wasn't some scandal. It was quiet, subtle, a shift in tone, a choice not to show up. A truth withheld when honesty would have saved everything. They looked you in the eye and still chose the lie. And in that moment, something inside you snapped, not like a plate shattering on the floor, but like a lock clicking into place. You stood there, breathing slower than usual, as their words bounced off you like echoes in an empty hallway. The version of you they knew, the one who cried, explained, begged, fought to be understood, was gone. Not because you stopped caring, but because you'd cared yourself to the edge. You realized right then, no amount of tears, no volume of your voice, no carefully chosen words would ever make them. You didn't yell. You didn't slam doors. You didn't even raise an eyebrow. You just went quiet. A silence so sharp, so deliberate, it shook them more than any scream ever could. Because that silence, it wasn't confusion, it wasn't hesitation, it was strategy. You weren't retreating, you were removing yourself. You weren't searching for the right words anymore. You were reclaiming your worth. They kept talking, kept trying to provoke a reaction, pacing, throwing phrases at you that used to unravel your spirit. But you didn't flinch. You just stood there, looking at them, the way someone looks at a locked door they've already decided not to knock on again. You felt it rising in your chest. Not rage, not grief. Clarity. That sharp, unwavering awareness that this was no longer about fixing anything. This was about finishing it. They didn't notice the shift. Not yet. They thought you were shutting down. What they didn't know was you were powering up. That silence, it was preparation, calculation, a goodbye said with no words, just distance. You weren't just done with the conversation. You were done with the cycle. The manipulation dressed as care, the selective love, the games, the I didn't mean it, after every emotional sucker punch. You'd finally stopped spinning in their chaos long enough to realize you weren't standing in love, you were standing in survival. They walked away from that moment thinking they'd won, that they'd gotten the last word, but the last word was yours. It just wasn't spoken, it was felt. In the way you moved differently after that day, in the way your energy stopped orbiting theirs, in how you stopped texting first, stopped explaining, stopped chasing moments that always ended in heartbreak. You began choosing silence, not as surrender, but as a boundary, as power, as protection. And here's the truth most people never admit. The moment you stop explaining yourself, people panic. When you stop reacting, they feel the weight of their actions. When you go silent, they start hearing the echoes of everything they refused to listen to. When you were still speaking, that's when they feel it. Not during the storm, but after it's gone. When the calm finally arrives, and with it, the absence of something real. That turning point, it wasn't about ending the relationship, the friendship, or whatever label you gave it. It was about ending who you were within it. The version of you that tolerated half love, half truths, and half effort. The version that made excuses for disrespect. That believed love meant fixing what someone kept breaking. That version died in that moment. And in its place, someone new was born. Someone quieter but stronger, softer but smarter, still kind, but no longer available for anyone. They don't talk about this part of healing. The part where you say nothing, but everything starts changing. When your silence isn't cold, it's sacred. A sacred decision to stop bleeding for people who never bothered to check where you were hurting. You stop needing closure. Stop seeking understanding from those committed to misunderstanding you. You simply rise. And as you walked away, maybe not physically, but emotionally, spiritually, you knew. This was the moment they'd remember forever. Not because of drama, but because of the absence, because you didn't scream, you didn't make a scene, you just disappeared from the version of yourself they thought they could keep walking over. You became someone they couldn't predict, couldn't manipulate, couldn't reach. They thought your silence meant weakness, but it was a warning, a final, quiet warning that the storm wasn't coming. The storm was leaving, and now all they'd be left with was stillness, the kind that haunts, the kind that whispers every night. You lost something you'll never be able to replace. The silence didn't just come, it settled, like fog creeping through a city that never saw it coming. In that stillness, something inside you changed. You weren't reacting anymore. You were recording. Every slight, every smirk, every "I'm too busy," every energy shift when your name popped up on their screen. You weren't blind anymore. You were wide awake. But this time, instead of trying to fix the cracks, you studied them, closely, quietly, with the patience of someone who had finally learned that love isn't proven in chaos. It's revealed in consistency. You started listening, really listening, not just to what people said, but to what they didn't. The hesitation before a promise, the way their voice dimmed when your success came up, the missed calls, the forgotten moments, the dry LOLs when you needed reassurance. You noticed the energy, the absence, the ones who showed up only when it benefited them. You stopped giving benefit of the doubt to people who only gave you doubt in return. And that silence, that was your classroom. You weren't sulking, you were studying. You started keeping track, not in bitterness, but in clarity. Who texts only when they need something? Who checks in when they have nothing to gain? Who celebrates you loudly, and who stays quiet when the light's on you? You realized that some people clap for you, not because they're proud, but because they hope you fail next. And that truth, it didn't break you. It built you. You began to pull back, not out of petty. You started journaling, not just your pain, but your patterns. Who made you feel anxious? Who brought peace? You weren't writing to remember them. You were writing to remember yourself, the you that existed before the manipulation, before the shrinking, before you thought silence meant you were losing. Because now you knew better. You weren't losing, you were watching, documenting, preparing. You didn't cut people off. You just let them reveal themselves. You stopped talking, and their masks fell off. Without the mirror of your patience, they couldn't hide who they truly were. You'd sit in rooms you used to light up, now watching how dull they felt without your energy. You'd smile less, but mean it more. Speak less, but say it with your whole soul. And the world started to feel quieter, not because it changed, but because you finally stopped filling it with effort that wasn't being returned. You healed, not loudly, but deeply. Late nights became your therapy, music in your ears, pen in your hand. You'd write letters you'd never send, not for them, but for you. To release, to reclaim. You stopped explaining your absence. If they cared, they'd notice. And if they didn't, well, that was the lesson. One silence taught better than any speech. You didn't announce your growth, you embodied it. You started to eat differently, sleep intentionally, move your body like it was a temple instead of a battleground. You weren't just mentally rising, you were spiritually reprogramming. Less scrolling, more strategy. Less chasing people, more chasing your purpose. You started building, not out of revenge, but out of rebirth. And while they were still watching, still wondering why you were acting different, still trying to bait you into reacting, you were busy turning your pain into preparation. You stopped needing their approval because you finally saw your own reflection without their distortion. That reflection wasn't weak, it wasn't broken, it was focused. You started waking up with intention, making plans that didn't involve them, setting goals that scared even you. You stopped needing validation from people who couldn't even validate themselves. And in the quiet of your room, while the world scrolled past you, you built not just habits, but standards. The silence became sacred. You didn't need noise anymore. The drama, the confusion, the constant need to be seen, gone. You didn't care if they misunderstood you. You cared if you misunderstood yourself. And every day that passed, you saw it clearer. This silence, this stillness, it wasn't absence. It was alignment. You stopped giving CPR to friendships that died long ago. You stopped reviving conversations that were only breathing because you kept initiating. You didn't burn bridges. You just stopped walking across ones that always crumbled when you needed support. And the best part, you didn't need to explain it to anyone. You didn't owe anyone a breakdown of your evolution. They had the chance to listen when you were still talking. Now they could watch in confusion as you transformed in silence. Because the version of you they once knew, that version was studying, plotting, healing, growing. And now you're not just stronger, you're smarter. This wasn't silence out of weakness. It was silence out of strategy. It didn't happen all at once. You didn't slam the door. You didn't throw one final dramatic monologue. The detachment came in waves, soft at first, almost invisible. You began with shorter replies, not because you were angry, but because you no longer felt the need to over-explain yourself to people who never listened in the first place. Where once you wrote paragraphs, now you wrote periods. Where once you defended your heart, now you simply protected it with silence. You stopped justifying your distance. You stopped apologizing for your peace. People started to notice, but they didn't understand. They confused your calm with coldness. What they didn't see was that you were finally learning the difference between connection and captivity. They'd say things like, "You've changed," as if that was a bad thing, as if growth was betrayal. But you hadn't changed. You'd simply evolved. You were finally putting boundaries where they had only placed expectations. And when they crossed those boundaries, like they always had, you didn't react. You didn't fight. You just detached. Not from a place of resentment, but from a place of recognition. Recognition that your energy was not a free-for-all, that your soul deserved more than shallow apologies and empty promises. Your detachment wasn't loud. It was measured, strategic. You started speaking less, not because you had nothing to say, but because not everyone deserved access to your thoughts anymore. Your words had weight, and you stopped throwing them into spaces where they were only ever used against you. You learned to sit with your own silence, to find comfort in your own company. That scared them, because people who are used to controlling your emotions don't know what to do when you stop giving them access. They started trying harder, calling more, texting more, sending messages that sounded like concern, but reeked of guilt. They missed the version of you that over-explained, overshared, overloved, the version that stayed on the call, even when the energy was dead, the version that begged to be heard, even if it meant whispering in a room full of people who were shouting for themselves. But that version of you was gone, and in its place stood someone softer on the outside, sharper within. Someone still kind, but no longer compliant. Conversations began to feel different. They noticed it. You were still polite, still patient, but your soul wasn't in the room anymore. Your replies became precise, no fluff, no emotional labor, just enough to be respectful, but never again enough to be depleted. They asked, "What's wrong?" And for the first time, you didn't feel obligated to answer. Because nothing was wrong, everything was finally right. You weren't punishing anyone. You were protecting yourself. They tried to bait you, poke you, reignite the old fire they were so sure still burned for them. But you didn't bite. You'd mastered the art of staying neutral in chaos. You didn't engage, not because you were afraid, but because your peace had become more valuable than their drama. And they hated that, because people who thrive on your reaction cannot survive your stillness. They wanted the old you, the one who broke her back to fix what they kept breaking. The one who said, "I understand," when she was the one hurting. But now you just smiled, tightly, knowingly, and walked away. And here's the irony. They started panicking, not when you yelled, not when you cried, but when you went quiet. That silence wasn't empty. It was a statement. It said, "I no longer need this to be okay." It said, "You no longer have that kind of power over me." And that terrified them, because they always assumed you'd stay, that your loyalty would override your logic, that your heart would always forgive what your eyes could no longer ignore. But they were wrong. Detachment doesn't mean you stopped caring. It means you finally started caring about yourself. You didn't hate them. You just couldn't keep betraying yourself for them. You learned to detach with grace. No tantrum, no revenge, just silence, just space, just boundaries drawn in invisible ink that only you could see, but ones they tripped over every time. And with each boundary came a new breath, a new layer of self-respect. You weren't burning bridges, you were just refusing to keep crossing ones that had no railing and too many cracks. And in that detachment, you felt powerful. For the first time, your calm was no longer confused with compliance. It was controlled. It was sharp. It wasn't about pretending not to feel. It was about refusing to let those feelings be used as weapons. You weren't suppressing your emotions. You were directing them inward, turning pain into strength, turning lessons into wisdom. You became emotionally sovereign, unshakable. And that glow, the glow of someone who no longer needs external approval to validate internal worth, became undeniable. People noticed. The ones who once drained you now looked confused. They asked, "Are you okay?" And you smiled, not the way you used to, not that broken, hopeful smile, but a real one, grounded, whole. You were more than okay, you were free. Because this wasn't weakness, this wasn't defeat. This was war without noise. This was what happens when a soul stops screaming and starts rising. And you were just getting started. They didn't notice the shift right away. At first, they just assumed you were in one of your moods. Maybe you were tired. Maybe you'd get over it. They brushed it off the way people do when they don't believe consequences are real. But the days passed, the weeks, and your silence didn't soften. Your distance didn't close. And then came the question that always arrives too late. Why don't you react anymore? You could see it in their eyes. The confusion, the nervousness, the subtle panic hiding behind small talk and emojis and late night, just checking in messages. They were starting to realize what you already knew. That silence isn't a void, it's a verdict. And they were standing trial in your absence. They tried to bait you with old habits, poking at memories, mentioning people they knew would get a rise out of you, bringing up inside jokes they never earned the right to laugh at anymore. But you didn't flinch. You just smiled, calm, unreadable. Because by now, they weren't looking at the same version of you. The one who used to break into pieces every time they looked the other way. That version had evolved. Now they stood face to face with someone they couldn't provoke, couldn't manipulate, couldn't read. And in that detachment you felt powerful. For the first time, your calm was no longer confused with compliance. It was controlled. It was sharp. It wasn't about pretending not to feel. It was about refusing to let those feelings be used as weapons. You weren't suppressing your emotions. You were directing them inward, turning pain into strength, turning lessons into wisdom. You became emotionally sovereign, unshakable. And that glow, the glow of someone who no longer needs external approval to validate internal worth, became undeniable. People noticed. The ones who once drained you now looked confused. They asked, "Are you okay?" And you smiled, not the way you used to, not that broken, hopeful smile, but a real one, grounded, whole. You were more than okay. You were free. Because this wasn't weakness. This wasn't defeat. This was war without noise. This was what happens when a soul stops screaming and starts rising. And you were just getting started. They didn't notice the shift right away. At first, they just assumed you were in one of your moods. Maybe you were tired. Maybe you'd get over it. They brushed it off, the way people do when they don't believe consequences are real. But the days passed, the weeks, and your silence didn't soften. Your distance didn't close. And then came the question that always arrives too late. Why don't you react anymore? You could see it in their eyes, the confusion, the nervousness, the subtle panic hiding behind small talk and emojis and late-night just checking in messages. They were starting to realize what you already knew, that silence isn't a void, it's a verdict, and they were standing trial in your absence. They tried to bait you with old habits, poking at memories, mentioning people they knew would get a rise out of you, bringing up inside jokes they never earned the right to laugh at anymore. But you didn't flinch. You just smiled, calm, unreadable. Because by now they weren't looking at the same version of you, the one who used to break into pieces every time they looked the other way. That version had evolved. Now they stood face to face with someone they couldn't provoke, couldn't manipulate, couldn't read. And they feel it now, the weight of it, the absence, the space you used to fill with reassurance, with effort, with belief in someone who didn't deserve it. Now all they have is the echo of their own choices, and the version of you they can no longer reach. You were their peace, their grounding, the one who stayed solid while everything else fell apart. And now that you're gone, everything feels. They thought you were bluffing, that your silence was temporary, that eventually you'd crack and come running back to the same place that broke you. But instead, you built something new, quietly, purposefully, and from where they sit now, outside the gate of your new peace, they can't even recognize the place they once felt entitled to. That's the part they'll never say out loud, that they took your kindness for granted, that they never believed you'd leave, that they thought you'd always choose understanding over boundaries, always choose them over yourself. But you didn't. And that silence, it wasn't punishment. It was your strategy. You didn't disappear. You evolved. While they whispered that you'd gone quiet, what they didn't realize was that you had gone inward. In the shadows, you weren't hiding. You were healing. While they were watching for your next reaction, you were rebuilding, brick by quiet brick. You weren't gone, you were becoming. And what was forming inside of you couldn't be explained in status updates or seen through filtered stories. This was private, sacred, a rebirth, not meant for an audience. Because this time, the change wasn't about proving anything. It was about preserving everything you'd almost lost, yourself. You started pouring into what mattered, your health, your purpose, your mind, your soul. While the world chased clout, you chased clarity. While they posted for attention, you prepped for impact. You weren't announcing your every step anymore. You were taking steps that didn't need to be seen to be real. Your mornings began earlier. Your workouts got stronger. Your mind sharper. Your conversations lighter but deeper. Your circle smaller but safer. The silence that used to ache, it now became your edge. They thought you were stuck, but in truth, you were stacking. Stacking wins, habits, boundaries, vision, self-respect. In the silence, you taught yourself to cook, to meditate, to breathe again without anxiety being the background music. You started reading more, praying more, creating more, rewriting your entire life, not out of revenge, but out of resurrection. This wasn't about them anymore. They weren't your focus. You were. You remembered your dreams, the ones you'd buried under all the emotional labor you were doing for others. You didn't need revenge. Your glow-up would be enough. And the glow, it came slowly, not with flash, but with foundation. You started walking differently, not with arrogance, but with alignment. You weren't seeking validation. You had direction. You stopped talking about who hurt you and started designing a life they would never again have access to. You see, while they thought you were done, you were just beginning. They thought you were folding. You were forging. They thought you were avoiding. You were ascending. Because some storms don't destroy. They design. And you were designed by every moment they thought would break you. Your confidence returned, not loudly, but like a whisper of wind that carries the scent of rain. Inevitable, unstoppable. You looked in the mirror and saw someone rising. Quietly, yes, but without limits. You stopped begging for space in lives that didn't honor yours. And in doing so, you carved out a world that didn't need to shrink you to fit. You stopped bending. You stopped explaining. You stopped shrinking to keep others comfortable in your presence. They didn't see the late nights, the early mornings. They didn't see the anxiety you tamed, the pain you carried, the discipline you built in silence. All they saw was your distance, but they never deserved to see the battle that gave birth to the warrior. Because your growth wasn't for their entertainment. It was for your evolution. And when they finally looked your way again, hoping for the version of you that once begged, cried, and compromised, you weren't there. In your place stood someone refined, someone sharpened, someone too grounded to be shaken, too evolved to be bayed. They thought you were hiding, but you were hatching. You had outgrown the version of yourself that clung to broken things just to feel whole. You no longer feared being misunderstood. You feared being unchanged. So you let go. You let the silence teach you. You let the solitude rebuild you. And now, your presence, your energy, it speaks before you ever say a word. You walk into a room and no longer wonder if you're enough. You know it. You feel it in your spine, in your breath, in the way your standards no longer bend for temporary attention. This is what they never expected, that the silence they once dismissed would return as your authority, that the quiet you kept would echo louder than their noise ever could, that while they gossiped, you grew, while they doubted, you developed, while they moved in circles, you moved in purpose. And now you're unrecognizable. Not because you changed overnight, but because you never stopped changing. You just stopped announcing it. Let them wonder. Let them guess. Let them hear about you through whispers and watch you through windows they no longer have access to. Because what you've built in the shadows, it's holy, it's unshakable, and it's yours. Now they reach for you. Suddenly, their silence has turned into a storm of noise. Texts at midnight, calls with just checking in, DMs wrapped in fake humility and unspoken guilt. The very ones who couldn't hear you when you spoke now desperately want access to your energy. The same ones who once left you on read, who rolled their eyes at your honesty, who dismissed your kindness like it was weakness, they want back in. But what they fail to understand is this: you're not silent anymore. You're unreachable. They didn't notice you when your presence was constant, when your heart was wide open and your loyalty wrapped around them like a safety net. They assumed you'd always be there, always waiting, always giving, always available. But what they mistook as permanence was simply patience. And patience, when pushed too far, turns into a locked door. No drama, no screaming, just a quiet exit and a key that no longer fits. Now they fumble at the gate of your peace, hoping the old you might still be hiding inside. But you're not there. You've moved, elevated, evolved. You live in a space now that requires truth, effort, and depth, and they've never known how to survive in those conditions. They weren't built for the version of you that exists now. The version that doesn't bleed for apologies that arrive too late. The version that understands forgiveness is a personal practice, not an invitation to repeat the same disrespect. They send messages that drip with nostalgia. Remember when? I miss the way we used to talk. I've been thinking about you. But they're not reaching for you. They're reaching for who you were, the one who made excuses for their inconsistency, who poured from an empty cup, who clung to hope like it was oxygen. That version of you is long gone, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. They ask to talk, but what is there to say? They ignored the warning signs. They turned their backs when your soul was collapsing in silence. And now they want shade from the very storm they watched you suffer through. But here's the truth. You don't ignore the rain and then ask the thunder to protect you. They want the storm to comfort them, but they forgot you are the storm now. Quiet, powerful, unpredictable. And they don't know how to sit in that kind of silence, because your silence isn't empty. It's charged. It's a reminder, a mirror, a consequence. It doesn't scream, but it speaks, louder than any apology that came too late. You don't hate them. That's what makes it harder for them to accept. You just outgrew the noise. You outgrew the cycle. You saw the pattern and stopped dancing to the same broken rhythm. You broke the loop with distance, not to punish, but to protect. You didn't slam the door. You just stopped holding it open. They scroll through your life now from the outside, watching, wondering, whispering. But they can't reach you, not because you're hiding, but because they no longer hold the frequency to connect. You're operating at a level that requires emotional fluency, truth, accountability, and they've only ever spoken in half-truths and blame. Now they want presence from a person they once treated like background noise. They want priority in a life they never showed up for. But here's the thing. Absence becomes permanent when presence is taken for granted too many times. You didn't leave to be missed. You left to be whole. And in doing so, you became a version of yourself that doesn't chase, doesn't explain, doesn't revisit old chapters just because someone finally decided to read. Let them text. Let them call. Let them write paragraphs you won't answer. Let them stare at delivered with a pit in their chest. You owe them nothing, no closure, no entry, no explanations for the boundary they forced you to build. Because when you were reachable, they didn't care to listen. And now that you've gone silent, you've become unforgettable, not because of your pain, but because of your peace. Because you walked away with dignity. You didn't drag their name. You didn't beg for recognition. You just disappeared. And now, your absence speaks volumes they'll never be able to read. You've become the lesson they didn't think they needed, the consequence they never thought would come. And now every text they send is a quiet reminder of what happens when you treat someone real like they're replaceable. Because you weren't just a moment, they just realized too late you were the miracle. It wasn't revenge, it was release. You didn't walk away to teach them a lesson. You walked away because you finally learned yours. And now, standing at this quiet, steady edge of your life, looking back at the battlefield you once crawled across, you don't feel anger. You feel clarity. You remember everything, not with bitterness, but with understanding. You remember how you kept explaining your heart to people who only heard convenience, how you stretched, bent, softened, hoping your silence would speak the love your words couldn't express anymore. And when even that silence was ignored, you knew it was time. The day you chose silence wasn't a collapse, it was a coronation, not a fall, but a flight. They thought you'd go out with a scream. Instead, you went out like a shadow, graceful, wordless, final. And that silence, it didn't echo, it stuck. It lingered like a ghost in every space they now find themselves alone in. You weren't being dramatic. You were done. You stopped defending yourself in rooms where your name had no respect. You stopped pouring into hands that never learned to hold you. You stopped explaining your loyalty to those who only valued your silence when it made them comfortable. But you didn't disappear in defeat. You disappeared in discipline. And while they cracked jokes and made assumptions, you built peace. You rebuilt yourself, quieter, stronger, untouchable. You found beauty in your boundaries, power in your solitude. You started sleeping deeper, laughing louder, not because the pain was gone, but because you weren't feeding it anymore. They thought your silence was the absence of a voice, but really, it was the presence of a standard. That silence became your sanctuary. It gave you back everything you gave away in the name of love, loyalty, and proving yourself. They didn't realize you weren't trying to win. You were trying to survive. And now, you thrive. Not because they lost you, but because you found you. In that quiet space where no one clapped, no one chased, no one said, you were right. You found power in not reacting, freedom in not explaining, clarity in not justifying. You no longer feel the need to write paragraphs to defend your soul to someone who never even bothered to read the truth when it was sitting right in front of them. Now, they sit with the version of themselves who let you go, not because you changed overnight, but because they never saw what was changing inside you the whole time. Every ignored moment, every insult passed off as a joke, every time they called you too sensitive, too dramatic, too deep, every time you showed up when they didn't, you remembered it all. And you used it, not to hate but to build. You became the one who doesn't flinch, doesn't chase, doesn't pick up the phone just because it rings. You became the one who doesn't explain peace to people who create chaos and call it love. That's your victory. That's your legacy. Not loud, not violent, but irreversible. They may one day whisper, you were right, but by then, you'll be long gone. Not lost, not hiding, just far past the point of needing validation from those who only valued you in pieces. You didn't raise your voice, you raised your standard. You didn't fight to be heard, you learned to walk away when understanding wasn't being served. And now, in this calm you created, your silence sings louder than all the noise they ever made. Every time they reach out and are met with space, every time they see you, glowing without needing their light, your silence speaks again. And what does it say? It says, I'm not mad, I'm just done. It says, I'm not avoiding you, I've just evolved beyond you. It says, I didn't need closure, I became it. And you didn't have to slam doors or write call-outs or post poetic captions. You just lived, peacefully, authentically, silently. And in doing so, you did more damage than rage ever could, because silence, it doesn't break things, it reveals them. Now they sit in rooms surrounded by noise, but haunted by your absence. They tell themselves it wasn't that deep, that you'll come back eventually. But deep down, they know. They know that when you finally got quiet, it wasn't a pause. It was permanent. Because silence like yours doesn't come from drama, it comes from decision. And you decided that being misunderstood was better than being mistreated. You decided that being alone was better than being used. You decided that peace was worth more than any relationship that asked you to prove your worth in pain. So let them talk. Let them twist the narrative. Let them call it distance. Let them say, you've changed the way you let people access your heart. You've changed the way you allow your name to be handled. You've changed the way you respond to being disrespected. And now, you don't. You just move on. And that movement, wrapped in quiet, in dignity, in strength, that's what they'll remember. That you left with no drama, no announcement, no need to explain yourself to anyone who wasn't listening the first 100 times. You walked. And with every step, you didn't just get farther from them, you got closer to yourself. So let the final words fade out, not in anger, but in knowing. Let them hear the closing lines in the space you used to occupy. Because in the end, silence wasn't weakness. It was always the most dangerous strategy.